All right, good evening. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm getting thumbs up back there. That's great. Good evening. I'm Dr. Andy White. I'm the president of Cleveland State Community College. Honored to have that role and be leading a bunch of folks who are working hard to partner with our sister institutions in the region to educate our neighbors and help them transform their lives and get ahead and thrive in life. And it's a pleasure to do that. Appreciate everybody being here tonight for your interest and passion for education and developing the folks and helping make the region stronger day by day. Dr. John Squires is here with me. He's another representative of our college. He's our Vice President of Economic and Workforce Development, and many of you know John, and he has been working to build these partnerships and alliances to help us get these things accomplished with you. Tonight, as I understand it, this event is going to be about discussing public policy matters, and that's what particularly higher education is. It's supposed to be a place where you can do that. We're honored to host this event. State Senator Adam Lowe behind me is the sponsor of this event and the organizer, and it's our pleasure to present this opportunity for him to do that. Just as a disclaimer, our institution does not endorse any particular party or position or participant in tonight's discussions, but we're very honored that they're taking place. We think it's great for our community, and we think we'll all be better for it. With that, I will hand things over and let the discussions begin.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. Thank you to Dr. White and Cleveland State for hosting us tonight, and thank you to Mix 104.1 and Mix TV for carrying this and live streaming it for those at home. We found this to be a unique opportunity to bring the State Board of Education to a local space and to partner them with our directors here on the ground to have kind of a measured discussion. I will say it's not just myself that has put this hosting together. The legislative delegation that represents Bradley County, which includes myself, Representative Kevin Raper, and Representative Dan Howell, all put this together tonight, and I'm privileged to moderate. I do want to introduce the panel that'll be answering the questions tonight. We'll all kind of chime in, and we're going to keep this relatively casual across the panel so we can have a good measured discussion. Before I introduce them, I will say that part of the reason in doing this is been the toxicity that exists in trying to have any measured debate around public education, how difficult it has been. That toxicity bleeds out to where people kind of hang on maybe some fringe issues that happen with education, and there's really a body of work that goes into making sure education in community runs well, is done well, that goes unnoticed because of the hot button issues that are often very toxic. So our hope tonight is to talk about kind of that body of work. We will kind of get into some spaces which are a little more controversial, so you can hear both from the board and you can hear from your directors of schools. The purpose of doing that is to kind of put it in context of the greater body of what's happening. I will say that we do have two representatives of the State Board of Education who are here. The State Board of Education is a nonpartisan entity at the state level. They are here tonight in their individual capacities as experts in their space. So much like I can't speak for the state Senate, they can't speak directly for the state board, but they do have a lot of valuable insight. To my immediate left is Nathan James. He is the Deputy Executive Director of Legislative Affairs for the State Board of Education. And then Bob Eby is next to him. He is our chairman of the State Board of Education. Many of you will recognize the two following individuals. Dr. Linda Cash is the director of Bradley County Schools, and then Dr. Jeff Elliot, who is beginning his term as the director of Cleveland City Schools. So to start, if you wouldn't mind, give them a big hand. We'll jump right into questions this evening, and most of the questions were gathered in consult with a lot of individuals involved in both planning this event, and so we're going to kind of stick to those questions. What I'll say is if you have questions for the panel, they'll be available in and around as we wrap up, and you can definitely talk with them and ask them those questions. So I'm actually going to start with Nathan James here. He's often in his role as legislative affairs before the House and Senate committees having to deal with policies and procedures at the state level. But before we jump right into questions, just a quick few sentences about yourself and what led you to this role and brought you here tonight.
Thank you. Well, I'm Nathan James. My mom was a teacher. I've not been a public school teacher myself. I do teach a little bit at Vol State and Cumberland University and a few other places in the higher education world. I started with the state senate in the late 90s, and I started specifically in the work of creation of education law, really in the mid 2000s with the creation of the Coordinated School Health Act in Tennessee. That was in a particular role. Went on from there to be the research analyst, which is a committee expert for the Senate Education Committee in Tennessee from 2009 to 13. Following that, I served as policy advisor for education and the workforce for the governor of Louisiana for a couple of years, and then came back to this role with the state of Tennessee. And so for me, I get the privilege of being able to, because of the independence of the State Board of Education, we're not part of the administration, and we're a nonpartisan board. And so having been around that process for a long time, it gives me the chance to respond on matters of K-12 and higher education to senators and representatives alike without bringing any agenda except excellence in education.
I'm Bob Eby. I'm the chair of the Tennessee State Board of Education. I am not an educator by training. I'm an engineer. My wife taught for 30 years, though, in the Oak Ridge schools, and my two kids went to public schools in the Oak Ridge system. I thought it might be a little bit helpful to give you a little bit of background of what the State Board of Education does and where we sit. So we sit between the General Assembly and then the Department of Education. And we set the rules and the policies. The General Assembly passes the laws, and then we set the rules and policies to meet those laws. We have 10 members on the state board, one from each of the 9 congressional districts in the state, and I actually represent the 3rd congressional district, so I am your representative on the State Board of Education. And we have 1 student member. I just came out of the National Association of State Boards of Education, and I think there's only 3 or 4 states where the student member has a full vote, and they do in Tennessee. And that student member brings a perspective that the rest of us don't have, so it's very important. And we are appointed for a 5-year term. That way we transcend a gubernatorial election so that we can be apolitical. And then recently the legislature passed a law, so now 4 of us are appointed by the governor, 3 of us by the lieutenant governor, and 3 of us by the Speaker of the House based on the district that we live in. And so again, that adds more independence to us. Our focus is on the student. Anyway, it's an honor to be here. I did serve on the local Board of Education in Oak Ridge for 16 years out of a 30-year period, so I understand some of the challenges that are in the local board, and then looking at it from the state board, you see a different perspective.
Thank you. I'm Linda Cash. I have had the privilege of being in education for 35 plus years. I had a great privilege of being at both in the classroom and at the administrative level. Did some work at the higher ed, and just feel very privileged to be able to represent public education. I will say it's extremely important as a director of school to be involved with the state policies and to be in communication with your legislatures, both at the local level and at the state level. But my experience with the state board has been more than positive, even though sometimes we may not agree. They're always responsive, and when it comes to policy and procedures and rules, they are listening and trying to make things work on the ground. So again, I'm privileged to be here, have a great board that I work with, and always our focus is on students and what do we do for students and what do we do. Does it affect the student in a positive way or a negative way? The partnerships that we have with higher ed are exceptionally important because it impacts our students, their abilities to earn credits before they graduate, to earn those certificates in the workforce development space. All of that is so comprehensive that if you don't take the time to listen and learn from entities outside of your district, you may not be doing the best thing for kids. So it's an honor to be here, and I thank you for giving me the privilege.
Good evening. I'm Jeff Elliot, Director of Cleveland City Schools. It's a privilege to be here this evening. Thank you for the invitation and being here with you. And I've had the privilege of being in education, public education, for 31 years as a teacher, as an assistant principal and a principal, and also district administrator. And all those hats that I've worn at each point, you learn a lot in the endeavors and get that perspective of public education and the roles of the individuals that you interact with, from families to the students to the community that we're involved in, along with our teachers, and it's a privilege to be able to do that. And so and when we're here tonight talking about policy and procedures and the way that we enact things, it's always good to know what those policies are, but to remember what we're about. And it's about the people that are involved in public education and how it affects them and how we can be an advocate for them. And so it's great to be here. Thank you.
Jeff, just hold on to that for a moment, if you wouldn't mind. I forgot. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Dr. White. I'll kind of add to that. I am Senator Adam Lowe. Dr. Adam Lowe, professionally, I have a doctorate from the University of Tennessee, our flagship institution. Go Vols! Pretty proud of that. But I began my educational career in supplemental education. I was an education director for the Boys and Girls Clubs and managed the tutoring initiatives and catch-up program that they had at the time. I did that for 3.5 years before I transitioned to higher education, and worked as an instructor in education policy and reform, education history policy and reform, and most recently, though, moved over to the graduate side, and so I'll have a lot of teachers, administrators, and superintendents, and oftentimes even school board members who are doing master's and doctorate degrees who come through that program doing educational research and policy research. And it's nice to work with them. You get a breadth of who's coming in the education field when you're in higher education. And it can be very encouraging at times as you can kind of see innovative leaders in that space. So let's jump right into questions. Not all panelists will take every question. In fact, there are some questions that I know the Board of Ed cannot take because we live in a litigious culture. And we're going to be wise with those answers tonight. But the goal is to be rather transparent. And I've advised all of our panelists tonight to speak freely and among friends so we can have a constructive discussion around education. So let's start with kind of the low-hanging fruit question here because it often goes unasked. I'm going to ask the simple question in the room. What is public education, Dr. Elliot?
Well, there's a lot of ways you can go with that, obviously, but public education is, first of all, involves the people in this room, the people listening here tonight and watching. It involves our students first, and I always want to bring them out first to talk about what is it about in the students in our community and providing the best opportunities for our students and looking for ways to bring them to a successful experience in life, and that's the first goal. But also it involves not only students but our teachers, and the teachers are the key to public education. They make things work. There's no exception or replacing a teacher in that classroom. And we can talk all day about other options, and there are options out there, but when you have an educated, professional teacher in front of those students, there's no replacing. So that's a big part of it. Families, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to have that connection and to bridge those relationships there. Community members, public education, and the list goes on, but our board members and our board who enacts and the policy makers is an important piece of that, and our whole community. So it's involving everybody, and it's the opportunity with public education is about communication. And keeping that door open and being available to hear the perspectives from each individual so that we can make informed decisions as we continue to grow and have our students lead to success in the future so that it can meet the needs of what our community and our families are looking forward to as we move forward.
I'm going to kind of expound on that. This is kind of a guided moderation here. So, wonderful answer, Dr. Elliott. So, when we talked about public education, Dr. Cash, is it synonymous with public schools, or is it something more when we say public education? Are those two synonymous?
So I'm going to go back to thinking about what public is. Public is opportunities for all. So when I think about public schools, that means that when students show up and families show up, we are, as a public institution, called to work with them no matter where they come from or what they do. It's our job to be sure we're creating future citizens, future workers, all the pieces that go into maintaining a society. When public education first started, it was to educate because there were uneducated people, and in order to have a prosperous society, you have to have education. So when you ask, is it separate? I think education is opportunities for all. How people reach that education it may look different and be different, but if you are talking about what most people think about public education, it is we take all. So we are responsible both at the state level and at the federal level, and we have responsibilities that provide for our students with higher needs, students with advanced, but our ultimate goal is to produce citizens that can operate in a society and help grow our society. So when you walk into any classroom that is publicly funded, and I'll talk about that piece of it, publicly funding, in the Constitution in Tennessee, we are required to fund a public school system, which means we can't turn kids away. We can't turn families away. But what we have to do then is start looking at how do we diversify that, because one student who comes in looks very different than another, and that moves into what the state board does, is adopting standards for us. I mean, it's a very complicated system as we stand today. I think in our forefathers, when they were establishing public education, it wasn't that complicated. It was simply educate the children so that we have a society that can read, write, have open debates in politics, and now it is really opportunities for all. And I think in where Jeff and I sit, it's looking at how do we provide equal opportunities for those students. And, I reference that because if you are choosing something outside of publicly funded education, you may not have to adhere to the rules and regulations that we have to abide by. So when we are looking at it like, how do we training the teachers, educating the students, providing bus transportation, food services. It is such a complicated system in the public world that you have to be ready to not only fund it, but to educate the people who are in the classrooms to teach those students. So for me, as a lifelong educator, and my children being in the public schools and having other opportunities if we chose, we always felt like our students had what they needed to be in a public education. And again, it may look different for different people, but when you talk to me about public education, I'm talking about I don't have the or the authority to tell you that you cannot come. We can talk about zoning and all the other stuff that gets even more complicated, but I firmly believe that public education does a great job. And we have we visited schools today where we had English language learners talking to us about, when they first came, they were scared, and now they are. These were fourth graders, and they're fluent and still learning, and we're very proud of that. We want to serve them, but it is a very difficult job. It's not something that it's so different than when I was in school and when most of you were in school, that a teacher can't just stand there anymore and say, do this and do that. It's, okay, they need this and they need this. Oh, and we've got a pullout coming because by law we're required to do differentiation. And so public education is what it is. Serve all to the best of your ability and be sure we're moving those students forward.
We'll move to the state board, and to jump a little bit, Dr. Elliot kind of got in front of it. He listed a lot of the stakeholders. He mentioned the families, he mentioned the children, the teachers, the educators. Are there other stakeholders in public education that maybe go unrecognized? I mean, we know the policy makers and things like that, but any other stakeholders in what we would consider not just public schools, but public education as broadly?
Well, I think as Dr. Cash says, public education is for all. It's the whole state of Tennessee. And if we think about the purpose of public education, it is to prepare students for the mission for the state board is to prepare students for post-secondary success. Public education as a whole is to prepare students for a livelihood to be able to do that. And so the workforce, the education workforce is a big issue. So the entire workforce industry is part of public education because Tennessee is one of the top 2 fastest growing states in the country, I believe. And the reason we are is because of the economic opportunities. And we have to educate the students to be able to fit those jobs. And so the stakeholders include, whether it's the industry, whether it's the medical field that's providing, the services to those students. I mean, it's every person in the state of Tennessee is part of the public education.
Nathan, you get the next one here. So unless you want to add something, is there anything you'd like to add to any of that?
Well, what I would say in terms of that is to emphasize the point that without a public education system that teaches people how to think and think critically, no republic can survive. So when it isn't just about reading, writing, and arithmetic in terms of how that looks on a test, but it's also about the ability for a people to govern themselves. And without putting our children in a place where the norm is kind of self-challenge, the learning to live in a society that has such trouble talking to each other and getting through that so that we have a lot of years of prosperity ahead of us. That, I think, is an incredibly important part of public education. You talk about the stakeholders. I mean, there are 3 things that state government has that everyone is involved in. Roads, you got to get from here to there. Jurisprudence, when the light turns red, the car needs to stop or society falls apart, right? And the third is education, because whether you're hiring or you're buying a house, or you're selling a house, or it's your kids or your grandkids, or you don't have kids, public education absolutely affects each and every walk of life in Tennessee. So when we talk about who are the stakeholders in Tennessee, it's the 7 million of all of us. I don't think there's anybody that isn't a stakeholder one way or the other.
Thank you. You had mentioned the role, and one of the statutory obligations that we have is to do public education. Dr. Cash, you mentioned that as well. And it's not just about how interlaced it is in society. A lot of times it has to do with the fact it's the largest expense that we accrue both at the state and the local level. And I see several of our school board members here and county commissioners, and they have to steward those dollars through. There's been a lot of criticism in the past few decades around reforms in education. So I want to pivot that to you as people who are in it and on the ground. In the past 20 years, what would you say have been some of the most successful reforms and changes that we've seen in public education?
Well, as time goes on, and having been intricately involved in the reforms, especially that took place from 07 to 15, that really thoroughly changed what Tennessee education looks like. And I mean, for 6 to 7 decades prior to that point in time, we were at 48th and 49th at most everything. And now, while we're not in the top 10, 24th and 32nd and 20th is a whole lot better than 7 decades at 48th and 49th. Now, how did those things happen? Well, there were a lot of different reforms that took place. Frankly, Title 49 is a book about yay thick, and it is all of the laws of Tennessee education. And it took going through there. I mean, there were a lot of laws that put decisions about public education not in the hands of the elected officials and not in the hands of educators, but in the hands of certain groups that were involved politically. That had to change. Tenure reform had to change, because up until that point in time, and we've had wonderful teachers in Tennessee, don't get me wrong, but up until that point in time, if you had a pulse on the first day of your 4th year teaching, you could look forward to a review about once a decade, and you could look to it taking an act of God for you to be removed from your position. And at the same time, we were telling everyone that this is the most important work. But no other line of work was so insulated. And so you take that, you take strong academic standards, allowing superintendents to pay, using differentiated pay, so that they could put the money where the greatest need is. That wasn't even legal up to that point in time. It wasn't even legal. So there have been a great many reforms. And a lot of those that took place we don't even think about because they're not on the tip of our tongue anymore. But without them, Tennessee would be near the bottom because we stayed there for 7+ decades.
I think if you just want to get in a couple of specifics, talking about reforms and academic standards, just look at what we've done in literacy over the last several years. We're not where we want to be, but we've made significant progress. I think we want to continue to do that in other academics like math. CTE is another area that we've made a lot of progress in. I think the governor put in, $500 million or something into our CTE programs, and you look at what's going on. Every student isn't bound to go to a 4-year college. But again, going back to the mission of public education is to prepare students for post-secondary success. CTE does that and provides that opportunity. If you look at what we've done in CTE over the last 20 years, it's unbelievable. If you go to some of these, here in the community colleges and the models that we have between the community colleges and the high school, the middle college program, students can get a 2-year degree, associate's degree from a community college 1 week before they get their high school diploma because of the opportunities that we have now, the blending that we have between community colleges and high schools. So those are, I think, perfect examples of what's changed over the last 20 years to provide our students better opportunities for success, for post-secondary success.
So in education, you can watch the pendulum swing. And so in literacy, we obviously we're swinging back and have in Tennessee gone back to what is good for kids in learning to read with phonics and literacy and fluency and all of those pieces. But I believe in accountability, and I think it's necessary for us to self-check ourselves. But I would tell you that in all the reform that's happened, I believe training teachers and putting the appropriate professional development in for teachers, since they're the boots on the ground, is really what makes the difference. So if we're not looking at the teacher in the classroom and making sure they have the support they need, we can refine the standards, we can look at all the accountability, but if we haven't actually trained the teacher and given the teacher the support, then we're going to find that we're going to stay flat. And again, professional development is pricey. And so asking the teachers what they need going in the classroom, because if you don't monitor it's you don't know whether it's working or not working. We spend a lot of time in the classrooms. We spend a lot of times training. But I'm also a firm believer that sometimes you can hold too tight and then the teacher doesn't feel like they have the flexibility to serve the kids that are right in front of them. So there's a balance that you have to allow the teachers to do while still knowing and understanding that we have these accountability pieces, we have standards that we have to teach, but we also have those little people in the classroom and at the high school level that may need a day where they're just being able to connect and do something different. That's where, thankful for the state of Tennessee, bringing all the STEM and STEAM into and giving us access and finances to put those in where students actually have hands-on opportunities. I want to say I've seen a full swing, specifically in Bradley County, about industry and workforce development being involved in our high schools and our middle schools. That's a game changer. Knowing that we're going to produce the kids that they want us to produce with the skills that they need. So we are, I'll tell you, and I know this is not here, one of our biggest challenges right now, and I think Dr. Elliot would agree, is the influence of social media and the number of hours that kids are spending on phones and iPads and pieces that their brains, the attention that used to be this long, it's this long. So we are doing our very best to pull back from some of it that we're using in the classroom. And in student advisory, the biggest thing that the kids said to me, these are middle and high schools, is we don't want the devices, we want our teachers. That is so powerful. They can't make a connection with a device, but they can build a relationship and make a connection with students. And their teachers, they love them, they value them. And so providing what those teachers need, The standards made a huge difference. The standards are extremely rigorous, but a teacher has to have the ability to be able to break that standard down and to study the lessons, and sometimes you have to be flexible enough to let them do that. What I hope for our future is that we continue to work with industry, we continue to work with higher ed, but we in Tennessee need to keep the gas pedal going. We need to say we expect a lot, but we'll also provide those supports. And with that, it takes money and support from the state, from our local legislatures, from everybody in order to do that, which means we have to be talking to them.
Before Dr. Elliot answers, my lovely assistant has arrived, and she has water for you guys. So just ignore her as she brings you a bottle of water as we answer questions.
All right. No, I was going to say many of the things that have already been mentioned, we're doing a lot of those things in Cleveland City Schools with the articulation and with Cleveland State as far as our Tennessee Valley education program that we have here in early college. We started that several years ago in Cleveland City Schools, and that's been phenomenal. We've seen how that's changed and been a game changer at our high school with our high school students. But I'll go on a little bit about the academic side of that related to the not only the academic standards being risen over the last 20 years, and we saw that transformation around 2010 and really wrestled with that, but that was a good reform as we worked through that. The other piece of that was the high quality instructional materials that we're looking at now in our classrooms, and really taking a deep dive of keeping those standards high and the type of materials that we're using, and having our teachers, again, with the professional development. It takes time to train our teachers and to work through that, and so with the reform, takes time for our teachers to work through that. A couple other things I was thinking of over the last 20 years that really has, I think, made an impact is you had mentioned it earlier a little bit about coordinated school health. Over the last 20 years, reaching, again, in public education, looking at our students and not only the academic needs, but the health-related needs and the services that these students need, and screening them and finding out what they need to be able to see in the classroom, what they need, are they hearing the lessons? So that's been an important and an impact piece for us. And then the last piece I'll just hit on before we move on to the next question is, again, piggyback on technology. Look where we've come over the last 20 years in the world of technology. And obviously 4 years ago when we were working through this, that propelled us basically into technology, into the classroom as far as one-to-one devices. I know our school systems are there, and many school systems across the state have reached that. And so technology has been a huge reform. And so now we're having this discussion, as Dr. Cash was talking about, is that technology in the hands of our students, and how we balance that, and how we find where are those boundaries, and making sure we are setting those boundaries in the classroom with those cell phones that are in the hands of the students, and dealing with social media and the impact that it is having on our students today. So it's exciting to look back and consider the reform, but also to look ahead and know that we do have challenges ahead that we can continue to talk about, but we've come a long way.
You know, this is a good opportunity for me to remind everybody, including those watching online, that we have two very decorated school systems represented on our panel today. Bradley and Cleveland are revered in the state, have been very successful in endeavors, and a lot of the successful reforms really have to do with how they're implemented at the local level. I'll chime in and say for these folks, Bradley County's taken a really aggressive effort on coordinated school health. Some of this is response to a post-pandemic educational culture. Parents demand for schools to be open. Employers want parents at work. And coordinated school health goes even beyond what Dr. Elliot had mentioned with seeing and hearing, but how do we provide very basic care at the local school level so a parent's not having to get off of work and take their kid to school. So sometimes we think this big macro level when it comes to educational reform, what's handed down from the federal government, what gets all the public attention, but sometimes these small little reforms that happen at the local level that are responsive to the needs of community get the most mileage out of what impacts students. So I want to commend both these school systems on that. A couple of things were mentioned, and so we'll just go straight into one. We talked a lot about teachers and professional development, so let's take that to a really fundamental question. And I'm going to ask you to try to distill this down to your most profound talking point that you can possibly do. What is a good teacher?
Wow. First of all, I think a good teacher has to have a heart for students if they're going to be spending the entire career and day with the students. So that's obvious, but skilled and trained and knowledgeable in their field and knowing their content is always an important piece of a good teacher. And then also somebody who has the empathy and understanding of what students are dealing with in this day and time and connecting with the families and being open to that. And the last piece, because I'll let other people respond, but communication. I come back to that communication. Making the connection, being open and really being ready to listen to the student, and then being able to reply and communicate that, because as a teacher, you have to understand where that student is on that level and how are you going to connect and communicate with them to bring them along so that they are learning. If you're a teacher, if you're an effective teacher, the students, you have to be able to see evidence of learning. And we can have people in the classroom, but if the students aren't responding with the learning and you're being able to assess the learning, then how effective is the teacher? So a good teacher is somebody who can connect and communicate that information, but be willing to take it to the next level and hear from the students.
Can you clarify, did you say what a teacher is not?
Well, I guess that's the antithesis of the question. But yeah, my children are in public education, and my wife is in public education, and we oftentimes use that phrase, good teacher. Oh, they're a great teacher. What makes for that? Like if we're trying to tell folks whether it's a skill set coming up behind us or we're trying to identify that trait, you do a lot of hiring in that space. How do you identify that?
So one of the things that I always say is that a principal's greatest responsibility is to hire well. If you hire well, then everything else starts to fall in line. But when we are looking for great teachers, and that's what you want, you really want someone who is they're confident in who they are, but they're also willing to build relationships with students. So, because once you build a relationship with a student, that student will work harder than they've ever worked anywhere else. The other part, and I always ask coachable questions, can they be coached? Are they so set in their ways that they already know where they're going, they already know what they're doing? Because in our world, education changes fast. And so when something new is coming down, they don't know. And so to relearn and retrain, so being coachable, but also you have to be invested. You have to know and understand that you're changing the lives of every student that you meet. And that includes the lives in the families. And you have to be willing to understand that kids are not cookie cutter, that they differ and they have different needs, but really all they want is a teacher who loves them, is invested in them, and then what we need the teacher to do is to be highly trained and highly qualified and willing to do the work it takes to be proficient in the skills in the classroom. Unfortunately, in where we are today, a good teacher has to have unbelievable classroom management, because we are moving and shifting, and you've got kids at different levels who are doing different things, and they have to keep their hands. So that classroom management, even if you don't come in with strong classroom management, if you're coachable and you're willing to learn and work, then we want you. One of the pieces that I walked by a teacher's classroom today, and I was telling several of them that were with me, there's a rock star in that room. And when I say rock star, she is a rock star. Like, she loves every kid in there, but she has high expectations for every one of them. But her planning and study for the lessons, you will never walk in her room where she's not ready and understanding what she's supposed to teach. But she's also kind. And I think that's where we're gone from the ages of where you can yell and scream at a kid to get them to do anything. So building those relationships, being prepared for the lessons, and wanting to learn and wanting more. But as administrators, we also need to learn sometimes there has to be a balance. They've got to go home. And a lot of our young teachers, in specifically, we will say, okay, you can't live here 24/7. You've got to have something outside of this to renew yourself. So I'm always looking. I do. Even in restaurants, I'll notice some characteristic that I think, okay, that's a good teacher. And I'll say, are you in school? What are you doing? And my husband says, I cannot believe you're doing this. I'm saying, look, I'm looking for them everywhere. So, but yeah, it's someone who believes in what we believe, that we make a difference, and that we're preparing students for the world.
So I say a good teacher is a good leader. I'm a student of leadership, and there's a book that was written by Kouzes and Posner. It's called The Leadership Challenge. And it said the 5 attributes of a good leader are: they challenge the system, they inspire a vision, they model the way, they enable the team, and they encourage the heart. So when I think of a teacher, challenge the student. We heard this last week. I was at a national conference, School Board Association. We heard Missy Testerman, who is the National Teacher of the Year from Rogersville, Tennessee. She talked about challenging the student. Don't just let them do things easy. Really challenge the students to expand themselves. And so then you want to inspire a vision. You want to let them know where they can be 10 years from now. Give them that vision to be looking at down the road. Give them something to go for. And then model the way. Don't ask them to do anything that you won't do. As you teach them how to teach. Then enable the team. So you want to enable each one of your students. Give them the skills that they can do their job. And then finally, encourage the heart. Celebrate with them. I think those are the attributes of a good teacher.
Well, I was going to quote Missy Testerman, too. Just to say that one of the things, obviously, love and empathy and those things are very important, but she said very clearly also, you can't love a child into proficiency. You have to have the expertise in what you're talking about. And so that's important as well. You have to actually know what you're talking about. And especially grade 8 through 12. As you're preparing students to come to higher education, and higher ed takes a look at that grade that they got in high school, that grade has to mean something. And that means knowing what you're talking about as an instructor and having the expertise in the subject. So you can talk about it without the teacher's edition in front of you. That's an important thing.
Hold on to that one. I will say, I often go back to this with some of my students, which is be someone people want to learn from. And that kind of encompasses just not the sage of the stage. We talk a lot about that in higher ed. The model of sage on the stage has left, where you can just give lectures, expect people to take notes. To be someone people want to learn from, they have to feel some sort of connection with you. Many of us have been around experts who are very astute and very proficient in their field, but we don't particularly want to learn from them. And we might take someone who's less experted in that field because we feel like maybe they connect with us on an educational level, an understanding level, a compassionate level. And so when I think back as a student, you mentioned being a student of leadership, when I think back of growing up in public education and the teachers that I interacted with, when I think the most fondly upon some, that's the factor. I wouldn't argue that they were the best at English or the best at math, but I wanted to learn from them. And so I still think that that's relatively at play there. To continue down that vein, it is reported by some that teachers are our #1 burned out profession in our state right now. We're having trouble keeping teachers, having trouble recruiting teachers. Why do you think that is? Do you believe that is? Do you believe it's a profession that's gradually getting burned out? And what do we do about it? How do we respond to it if that's the case? How do we keep those good teachers working?
Well, I will point out, because you've got a lot of folks here who can explain from day to day why their teachers get burnt out. I will say that in terms of the teacher shortage, our numbers are at about 1.6% vacancy, as opposed to the surrounding states are sitting at about 5%, and the national average is about 4.7%.
What elaborate on that? Why do you think that's the case?
Part of it is because we've got a whole lot of different ways to get in the classroom. We've got a lot of different licensure programs in Tennessee. It doesn't hurt a thing that we border more states than any other state does, right? That doesn't hurt a thing because we can recruit from other states. It doesn't hurt a thing that, when you move to Tennessee, you're not paying an income tax. We've got a lot of things going for Tennessee, and apparently, according to the numbers, that works. Now, that does not mean that there aren't shortage areas in a lot of different places, but it is focused in particular areas around the state. So I just say that to say that we don't live in a state with people that have been asleep at the switch on this issue in terms of getting enough teachers, enough qualified teachers into the classroom. And I think those numbers speak to that. Now, this is a society where everybody can sue everybody for everything. You've got a situation where the one place that we're bound in society to be together is in the public school. And so many demands are placed on teachers. My wife is, she's a special needs teacher, and she's taught children of a lot of different varieties. And she'd come home with bruises and everything else. Just, there's a lot to her that's endured there. But you talk to her about it, and it's a story of love. And, this person doesn't quite know how to express themselves in a different way. But our teachers have to do an awful lot. And so I'll say that. I know that doesn't sound very expertly. It's just Nathan and Nathan's experience. But I'll pass it on to professionals here.
So my wife retired after teaching for 30 years, and I think the biggest challenge we have is letting teachers teach. I think we require them to do everything. We require them to be a teacher, a counselor, a nurse, a social worker, you name it. We require them to do so much. And if we could, let them teach, then I think everybody wins. And that's the challenge that we have to do, is how to figure it out so they can teach. And as Nathan said, with the litigious situation right now, they can't discipline the children. It makes it difficult for them to discipline the children. They can, but it's very difficult, and they have to watch what they do. So anyway, let them teach.
So I think that we're fortunate that we have a lot of higher ed institutions around us. So we are not feeling the severe of a pinch as some of our other friends as putting teachers in the classroom. But when you enter a school, you're building a family. And when teachers feel like they are part of a family and that you are going to take care of them, then they know that. That does not mean that you walk in and your classes start at, and I'm picking a number, at 8. You might have, if you're elementary, you've got a 45-minute break in there. Maybe some days you've got a 50-minute break in there, but you're on from the morning to the end till that last student leaves. So it's not a let's sit down and prop our feet up. It's physically tiring. It's emotionally tiring. So you have to have people that you can lean on, and that's your peers. That building that culture, and I will tell you that the culture in a school makes a difference. And if we can create a culture where the teachers feel like they're going to be taken care of, they're going to be heard, if they need something, we're going to try our very best to supply that. It does not mean we're lowering our standards. It does not mean we're trying to do everything we can. I have a teacher in the room right now that there was a year where we had a young man in there that, and I'm proud to say I was in the room and he was wreaking havoc, and she kept on teaching and just kept on teaching. But there's no doubt that a child in that classroom, the teacher worries. What if they hurt somebody? What if I'm not doing my job? So as support staff, we try our very best to recognize that, to get in there, but there are rules and regs about when we can take the kids out and when we can't. But when it comes to the point where the classroom is breaking down, as educators, as leaders, as administrators, we have to be willing to say, we got to get that kid out of there. And that's a hard thing, because that one student needs more than that teacher can do. And we've now expecting her to be behavioral management and behavioral specialist while you're still teaching reading. And so when we look, I think that as a field of education, as leaders, we need to take a step back and say there are some situations where we can't say that child's least restrictive environment is that classroom, because it simply is not. They're not learning, the students are not learning. And a teacher who is in that situation, their heart breaks for that child. We all want to help. We all want to do what we can, but we're not equipped to do that. So when you look at that and you think about why do teachers stay, again, they stay because they feel like that school is their family, that they are loved, that they are cared for, but most of all, they love every student that walks through the door, and they know the families and they want to help, but they have to have support. And that means some days you have, close your ears, you have pajama days. Some days you have, we're gonna have a color run today. You've got to be willing to do the special things that make a school special. If I had to say what teachers are feeling right now, it's the pressure to serve all. We want to serve all, but are we equipped, and do we have the tools we need to do that? And that's where our struggle is.
I went to a retirement celebration of one of our public school teachers in my district who, after 40 years, retired, and she cried. And I asked her, I said, "Why are you crying? Congratulations." She said, "I'm leaving a piece of myself behind." And it really resonated with me that there's some truth to that walking away from a culture and a family.
Work environment is huge in any work environment, but when it comes to those schools and those classrooms, it is a family, and they need to feel supported, and we have some really good schools in our area and families within those schools. But what we see, talking with teachers and their heart and their knowledge and what they got into it was all about the students, and then they went to school to learn whatever their content and their license says on there, if it's an English teacher or a math teacher. But when they're in front of those students, and we take all the students and they bring in, every individual student brings in those personalities, which is a joy, but at the same time it comes with the challenges of the teacher managing those behaviors at times. That can be very draining on an individual teacher. Also, learning, making sure, again, we talked about communication earlier, but connecting with the students. Sometimes there is a language barrier in our schools, and that individual student and the teacher. And so that is a challenge. And so that goes beyond just teaching the content. It's getting to know how to balance that along the way. Teachers take these burdens with them at home. It doesn't end when the school day is over. They go home in this day and time. Sometimes they'll get a text or an email of the concern, following up with homework or an issue that happened in the classroom, and so it continues into the evening, and so it can be a very emotional and draining day that continues one day after another. But they're compassionate about it, so they are invested in that world. And so that is a challenge, and that is a huge burden for our teachers and our professional staff to take that each and every day. But the thing is, when we walk into those schools, those individuals are committed to it, though. Even though it's a burden, they know why they're there, and they're committed to it.
We have a couple of your funding bodies in the room tonight, but so we're going to pivot. Let's talk about money. And I know that, Bob, you brought up money a little bit with regard to reforms. So in the past 6 years, Tennessee's roughly $1.6 billion to the plus in public school spending, specifically public schools. So my question is, you mentioned the reforms around CTE. There's about a $500 million reform there. Where has it gone, and did it matter? And I think it's great that we're starting on this end.
Sure. I mean, the funding that we've gotten the last few years, we can really look back, I think, the last 4 years of the additional funding that came during the ESSER funding and the state funding that came out. Where did that go? And I will say that for us, an area that we really concentrated was intervening and providing interventions, tutoring programs, summer programs that would help and bring the students along to bridge those gaps. And we've seen encouragement through growth in our reading scores over the last few years. And I think a lot of it is not only the instructional shifts and the high quality instructional materials that we've offered and provided that professional development and invested in that, and our teachers have taken on that challenge and done a great job with that, but also the funding to be able to provide after school tutoring, summer programs has been important. And that's where a lot of the money has gone. I will also say that a big chunk of it is, as you look at the post-secondary world and graduating our students and seeing the success, we're proud in Tennessee and locally that we have high graduation rates, and we're seeing that increase over the last 6 years. So I would look back at saying the efforts that we have put in, we're seeing results with that in that graduation rate, and we want to continue that. And so those are two areas in that academic world that I wanted to highlight.
So one of the pieces that I will say is that with the funding, salaries, teacher salaries, we really focused on trying to get those teacher salaries up. So our two systems, especially in the Southeast, were probably the first to go ahead and hit the $50,000 as a starting pay. But when you did that, everybody else's salaries had to raise as well. And our school board was really behind that, as well as our county commissioners. So that is a great start. Invest in your people. And I will tell you, not only we invested in technology to make the jobs easier, we invested a lot in STEM and STEAM. We also wrote grants above that. We have spent money on hiring more counselors, more social workers, trying to relieve some of the pressure that the schools were feeling on being all. We hope that we can continue those. And I will also tell you, by no means, and Jeff talked a lot, Dr. Elliot, I'm sorry, has talked a lot about communication. Buying software where it translates every language so that when you're sending something out, you're reaching your families in their language. So when we look at the comprehensive piece, all of it takes funding, but you have to analyze, is the funding making the shifts and changes that you need them to make? We try our very best to give the schools opportunities to ask for their needs. Our capital outlay is huge. It's from every school. What do you need that we can help you with that can keep things moving? So looking at every dime to see if it's going to impact the classroom and the teachers' help. We also do a tremendous amount in extra activities for our kids, providing clubs, and that takes money. So we support our teachers with items that they need, but we also support them with small stipends. So everything that we look at is, where does the money go? It should be touching a teacher and a student, or supporting that teacher and that student, and it's expensive. And there's not a better place to put your money. We would like more if you want to talk about that.
We are going to talk about that.
So I really think it's invested well. I know locally it's invested exceptionally well.
But before you pass that on, I know that there's kind of an agreement amongst the state board not to discuss funding too much, but is there anything you can chime in on this? And if we could get a CTE course here at Cleveland State on how to open a bottle of water, I wouldn't have spilt it all over myself here, Dr. White.
I'm glad you did too, because I did too. No, I would echo what they've said. I think they covered it pretty well. I would just say a couple of things is, from a technology standpoint, certainly one-to-one devices for students, for computers, salaries, a differentiated pay, which provides an opportunity for districts to choose to use some of the salary money to hire some of those difficult positions to hire, and to reward those exceptional teachers. I think those are a couple areas. And then facilities. There's been a lot of the ESSA money that was one-time only money went toward improving facilities. So I think there's a lot there too.
And just to be clear in terms of, when a question comes up about is funding enough, to keep in mind that every time we get a new state board member, within a week they end up, anytime anybody sues the state about education, all the state board members get sued. They're just named as defendants. So that's why there's certain things that we just, we're not going to necessarily address. But when we talk about $1.6 billion, and you're specifically referring to the state dollars, in addition to the ESSA and all of that, there's a lot that's happened from the literacy side to modernizing pay as far as the educators go. But let's also talk about how education is adapting and changing. And sometimes that's a difficult thing when you think about a system that was effectively modeled after, Prussian military schools in the 1820s, right? Everybody sits in a row and you try to learn without moving to the left or to the right too much, and all of those things that you think about with public education. But and it's apropos that we're here to talk about this next one, and that is with the dual enrollment programs have been and continue to be tremendously successful. We're with the passage of TISA, we've removed the financial disincentive to early graduation. We have made it possible for students to move more at their own pace at the high school side, and made it more the norm to blend the first 2 years of higher education and the last 2 years of K-12. And frankly, that's entirely reasonable to do. When you put a lot of money into CTE programs as we have, what's also important is these partnerships with the Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technology, because they have tremendous placement rates, right? And the legislature has increased the amount of money so that, if you're a student and you're headed to a university, you can get at least a year out of the way while you're in high school, with not just the possibility of credits being awarded like happens with some programs, right? Where if you happen to go to the right college, they'll give you credit. But no, dual enrollment, you're coming out with a year's worth of your university taken care of, which translates to tens of millions of dollars for Tennesseans that is saved through that process. But what's even more important, especially for rural Tennessee, is that those programs are equally accessible to the colleges of applied technology, because those students can come out, they can make a living, they don't need to move to Knoxville, they don't need to move to Chattanooga, they don't need to move to Nashville. They can make a living in those rural areas. And especially, one of the things, traveling with our State Board of Education members, I've been in all 95 counties. And you go to Lake County and you see how that county hollowed out in the 90s after Goodyear shut down up there. That was the big industry, and it kind of hollowed out. And kids, they'd grow up and they'd go get their degree and they'd never come back. Well, TCATs don't do that. And so when we talk about dual enrollment, we have to all be of the mindset that as much as possible should be the norm. And it's not just for kids who are going to get that 4-year degree, or they're pre-med or going to law school or something like that, but also those who are getting their truck driving and their mechatronics and their welding and all of these different programs that our colleges of applied technology offer, because those folks are really doing some great work, and the partnerships with the local districts are pretty tremendous.
Go ahead and pass that to Dr. Cash for this next question here. So yeah, let's get to one of the big ones, because you just mentioned you could use some more. I don't even need that anymore. People often argue public schools are underfunded. What does proper funding for public schools, if that's true, what is proper funding of public schools? What does it look like? It's currently about 74% of the state budget. Local, it's similar in that realm. as far as the amount of public resources that goes to that. What does it look like?
So interestingly, we just had to fill out a survey of the TISA funding and what that would look like if we wanted to increase the TISA amounts, what would it look like? So I had each department go through and look at it, and I will tell you, it was not this, we wish. Each line, we started saying, well, what's happening now that if we had more funds to go to behavioral specialists, how would that change what we're doing? We also looked as far down as the certifications for all of our CTEs where they're earning those industry certs. How much is that costing us? So when you go down at the line item, I think before I would say give me X amount of money, I would say that we would need to really dig and see what is the actual amount that would make us shift. Should it be a small incremental increase that covers certain things that automatically go up, like technology? The price of technology continues to go up. That actually is not part of the funding. It's part that we set aside because we know how valuable it is. And I would probably say we need to take a really strong look as a state at infrastructure, aging buildings, and if you are looking at any of that, you have buildings that even we have them that are 40. I think our oldest building is 40, 50 years old, somewhere in there. And then you've added on, so there are some parts of it that are new and some parts that are that. But that's really a difficult place because you're trying your very best to, support your teachers, but you also have all those other things. So when 84% of our budget, 80 to 84% is personnel. It's insurance, it's salaries, it's all of the taxes, everything of that. You've got a small portion over here that you've got to do the rest. Out of that comes your all your utilities. Everything's coming out of there. Now you're shrinking it down here. So then when you start talking about new buildings or repairing buildings, I think that's something that the state would need a specific formula about, which I did put in the TISA survey, is how do we support the ongoing upkeep of all these buildings, because it's extremely expensive. But when I look at the money, I think we figured it out. Depending on what you're looking at, you're doing like maybe a 5% increase, and we even talked about if you do like one-time money that you're going, that don't pull it away all of a sudden. Just it should gradually move because people become dependent on it. And the other thing that I would say with funding is that you should be accountable for your funding. We're audited every year, and the auditors basically live with us from like September to December, and we're at the questions they're asking. We want to be able to provide them all of that. So I don't think you just say randomly, "Here's more money." It's where is it actually going to impact, and what are we going to do it? And I know that we have a formula that doesn't actually tell us exactly what we have to do, but it really does, because when you only you have 20% to work with once it comes in. The other point that I would say, and I have been talking to the state about this, is the economically disadvantaged formula there's some shift in there that we're trying to figure out, where even though our kids we know they're still economically disadvantaged, it's not showing in the formula anymore because of the Medicaid. So there are things that you have to look at and watch, but overall with funding, I think I would look at infrastructure. I still would look at salaries, because I think if you really want to attract high quality teachers that want to stay, you've got to look at those salaries. They have to be competitive, and they have to have a living wage, not just, they can't buy a house right now. So I think that the salaries, infrastructure, and just the maintenance of the pieces that go up in price as we move. Anything you want to add?
Well, I'll just, a lot of that was kind of what we came up with in our TISA survey the other day, too, as well. I gave a lot of that feedback. Infrastructure, the economically disadvantaged piece is one that we're really watching those numbers and how that has shifted this year. We're really concerned about seeing that funding decrease, and we put that in there. The other piece of it, back to the salary piece, we are seeing the challenges that our teachers are facing with some of of the interventions and some of the needs that are happening between the behavior, special education teachers, and then we're having to have additional assistants and paraprofessionals in those roles to support. So we really are in need of additional funding to support some of those classrooms and to be able to help us in that role. The other thing we shared in that as far as additional funding is as we have had the TISA formula out there, one thing we are required to do at the district level is to share a lot of data back to the state level. And it's become more of a clerical demand on our staff to pull this data together to report it back. So some of that feedback is we need support at the district level. If we're going to keep the data going to the state so for the funding to continue, we need additional support in that role as well regarding that. So staff, obviously, the increase in that as far as funding. And again, as Dr. Cash spoke of, our contracts that we do for our ongoing annual subscriptions for academic needs, programs, materials, the technology piece, those don't get cheaper by the year, and so those continue to increase. So just those annual increments to increase on those subscriptions are very important to consider as well.
Pass it on down this way. We'll get our state board back involved with this next question. So since we're going with zingers, like is public education underfunded, a big topic of discussion in the state of Tennessee has been around school choice, specifically vouchers. Big universal question is there a place for school choice in public education? If so, what forms?
So let me go back and repeat what you said early. I speak for Bob Eby. I do not speak for the Board of Education because the board hasn't passed any rules. We won't pass any rules until the legislature acts, so we will follow the law. But if you're asking me what I think, first and foremost, I believe that every student deserves a right to have a quality education. And just because the zip code you live in, if you live in a zip code where your schools, and we now grade every school in the state, A through F. And if you're living in a school that has a D or an F rating, why should you be doomed to have to go to that school? So if there's an opportunity to provide for students to be able to go someplace besides their D or F school, I think we need to look at that opportunity. Now, if I were king for the day and I knew that we were going to have school choice, I would not want it to be done at the expense of public education. So I think about that and I say, okay, well, what can we do? And I say, okay, well, what if you had students that lived in D and F districts, provide them the opportunity to take that money and go to a school in a district beside there or someplace else. And that would encourage those schools that were in D and F schools to upgrade to become an A, B, or C school to preserve those students. And so then if they could upgrade and preserve those students and upgrade to an A, B, or C school, then the voucher program or the school choice program for that district would go away, but the students who are already in that could stay. I've never heard that being talked about, but I'm just sitting here thinking, if I were king for the day, if I had to do it, and that would encourage the schools who are not performing to perform better, and it wouldn't be done, that would hurt public schools.
Let's go that well. Before you answer, let's go to you guys. We'll finish with Nathan on that one. But to be fair, some of your systems already have some school choice. You have open enrollment in Bradley County. Beyond what you're already doing.
So I'm going to address something that Bob said that I think is a misnomer. So when you are labeling schools A, B, C, D, F, in the system that Tennessee has now, you can be a high-performing school district where you are outperforming with mastery of the standards higher than the state, and yet if your growth is low, it is not going to represent that 50 to 60 to 70% of your kids are proficient. However, because they did not grow, you may end up being a D or F school. So when I look at that, I think the state needs to take a hard look at what are you actually looking at. Are you looking at academics only, and what does that academic picture really look like? The second thing that I would say, if you're looking at a school holistically, our system does not, and I'm preaching, sorry, but I think there's so much more to schools than whether on a end of course or a TCAP test your kid scored in the 80th or 90th percentile versus what else are you offering those kids? How many after-school activities are they having? How many job-embedded situations do you have? How many CTE courses do you have? But my biggest thing is I can have a school, and this happens across the state of Tennessee. I actually was a principal of one of these. I think in the last principalship I had, my school, we were at 75% proficient, which means my kids were either at or above grade level at 75%. My value added was a 1 or a 2. And so instead of being the A school that 75% at proficient represents, we were a C or D. Now, did we need to reach our higher kids more and stretch our higher kids? Yes. But down the road in another school system, you had a system that their proficiency level is 15 to 20%. Their value added is at a level 5, and they are going to be a C, B, or an A school. So the discrepancies in the model that we have needs to be looked at. So that's my preaching.
I stand corrected. No, I hear what you say, and that makes a lot of sense. All I'm saying is that if a school is not performing, students should have the opportunity to go to school. And how we decide whether school, and maybe it's not A through F.
Thank you.
Yeah,
but
thank
I will also tell you, in the No Child Left Behind era, you did, as Adam said, have school choice. So if you were what they deemed back then was a failing school, you had the choice, and we had to provide the transportation to go to a higher performing public school, and that's what I think you're referring to. To me, instead of a voucher for a private school, you offer that, and then you're providing the buses and the materials. If those families want to go to a public school that is higher performing, they have that option. But in my opinion, and again, I do not speak for my board, my opinion is that public schools are the foundation of every community. And when you start doing something that does that, but I do believe that schools should have, if they're truly failing, and you're looking at all proponents, that they should have the option of going to a higher performing school publicly with busing provided. I'll stop.
Well, I'll piggyback on what Dr. Cash is saying, because we've looked at that from both angles of that, and the achievement and the TVOS and the growth that we're dealing with. And so we have some schools who are seeing tremendous growth, but their achievement is still it's medium. It's not the high, it's not the low, but they're seeing growth. And so we celebrate that growth, but we continue to want to raise that bar of achievement. So we've really wrestled with that, and we've talked about that in our system. Is we need that flexibility to say, are we seeing this improvement at the school between either achievement or growth? Because the demographics make up and help us out in that regard. And so we need to really look at that and have that flexibility to some degree, and have that as we set those goals and celebrate those goals in the way that our student body is involved with it, those schools and those community schools that we have. And also the transportation piece. Yeah, you have to provide that if you're going to do that, because if a school has a D or an F and the families there are having that choice, some of those families have to have that transportation if you're going to go there. But as far as choices, the word choice has come up here tonight talking about it. I think also is continue to give public education flexibility on choice within our institutions so that we can be even more innovative of how we can reach our students. If it means to flex our times or our programs or whatever the case is, give us a charge to be even more innovative than what we have the opportunity to be right now. And again, that might be more dollars to be able to do that. because we've talked and having that flexibility in some of the hours, but again, we're limited on our funds and staffing and how we can and think and do some things out of the box. But that choice within our parameters of public education would really be valuable for us.
Well, that's coming down to Nathan. I'm going to exercise kind of a point of privilege as the moderator. That mentality you just expressed, Jeff, Dr. Elliot, so try to keep it professional in here, is very refreshing, I think, to parents, rather than just such a militant response against the idea that maybe some parents want to leave public education, to respond with the, how do we create an environment no one wants to leave? Is I think, a really healthy mentality, and I've seen it from both of your school systems. I hope it's contagious in your peers, because I really think you see that in your teachers. You see their desire to keep the student in their classroom, to maintain the relationship with their family. And I think you really see a desire in our neck of the woods for families to want their children to be in the public educational system. There's a lot of pride in our systems, especially in this county, in Bradley County. And I think it comes from the fact that that's how you've chosen to respond to the narrative around school choice in our district, and I think it's been pretty valuable. Nathan, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I'll just share it from a personal perspective, and it's probably not necessarily what you're expecting to hear. I was born up US 64 in a little town called Franklin, North Carolina, and was born on the side of a mountain, and sounds very Abe Lincoln-esque, except when they turned the water on, every once in a while a salamander would come out. So my family understood Appalachian poverty, and my folks divorced before I was 6 months old. And so I ended up my summers in North Carolina and going to school in inner city Dayton, Ohio. And I took my wife to see the house that I grew up in until I got to the third grade, when my mom got her master's degree and we didn't have to live on government cheese anymore. And that house is worth $17,000 today. Most of your vehicles are worth more than $17,000, but I can give you the address. It's 23 Drury Street in Dayton, Ohio. Look it up on Zillow and you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, I had a mom who had the strength of character enough to go back and get her master's degree, become a reading specialist, and she did the gifted program for the school district there. And we lived well after that point in time. Now, if I had to live there and I hadn't had the mom I had, all the discussions wouldn't have done me a whole lot of good. So, when it comes to education and education reform, we're not in the business of making widgets. And I look at the ways we educate kids as like having a quiver full of arrows. And there's a lot of different ways that a lot of different people learn. And, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for public education. I have 5 kids, and they're all in public education. And 4 out of the 5 of them are doing pretty well. And the 5th one will get straight before it's all over. But I say that to just say, when we approach these things, look at it from that perspective. Think about what it would mean if you're in a spot that maybe you're not in right now, or your kids would be in a spot that maybe you aren't in, and think about it. How do you make it work the best way it can work for as many of those kids as possible? And usually that comes down to a whole lot more than a soundbite. That comes down to a whole lot of work. And, so I don't know. Take that for what it's worth. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think when you're looking at the truly educationally disadvantaged, and you're pouring everything you can into educationally disadvantaged kids, you're talking about something totally different than you are if you're saying we have universal vouchers. So if a child in a zip code, as Bob says, and true poverty, if they have an option to go somewhere and do something different, I think that's where you look. I do not think you look at families that A, can already afford, or B, that are already in private school, and then that's taking those funds away. I do think you concentrate on the educationally disadvantaged, the true educationally disadvantaged, and you give them opportunities in every way you can. I will still say, even with that, I truly believe there are public schools within those zones or in other zones that those students should have choice. I think there was somewhere where it said, possibly holding X number of seats open just for that purpose in a high performing school. And again, you come back to what is high performing, what is not. But if you're looking at the true educationally disadvantaged, then I think you're talking a different scenario.
I'm glad you brought that up. The universality of school choice is a point of contention in the legislature of whether or not it is universal or not. That is kind of an added debate. There are many people who probably are pro-school choice, but at the level of what we're talking about, educationally disadvantaged, not so much in the universal realm. So that is a point that is addressed and in debate right now. Very popular one. We've got about 5 minutes and 2 important questions, so I want to hit these because I think these might be the 2 important questions of the night. Earlier, you mentioned the problems we're having with our kids and what we know. We know we're on the verge of a mental health. We're in the midst of a mental health epidemic when it comes to our youth mental health. They're 3 times more anxious, depressed, and suicidal than they've ever been before, any generation before. We now have really solid data saying that that's related to what they consume with social media, asynchronous learning environments, and all of the above, how they posit their image in those spaces. Beyond the youth mental health epidemic, and you can chime in on that if you want to, really quickly, what do you think are the greatest challenges we're going to face in the next 5 years in public schools?
Devices and it's a terrible thing. To name it outright, the prevalence of pornography with our children in these devices, that is abjectly destructive to society as a whole, and for that to not be discussed is really forgetting a huge elephant in the room.
Besides mental health, and that's one area that I've really dedicated, I'm going to start working on. The other 2 areas I would say is filling the teacher pipeline and retention. And then math. We've made progress on literacy, but our math scores are worse than our literacy scores, and that's what I'd focus on.
I do think you have to focus on the devices and the interruptions that happen in the classroom. Most school districts now are going to a no cell phone policy during instructional time, which is a very positive. I think it's going to become even more important for us to manage that and do that. I also would say that you do have the mental health and behaviorals, and the behaviors we're talking about are young kids. We're not having as many outbursts and pieces in the older kids, although we're dealing with a lot. But I do think that continuing to prepare kids for the current society is important, and that means you're going to have to train teachers to do that, because most teachers are, like I am, lifelong educators. So being on the outside world in industry and business and all of that, you've got to continue to build partnerships with your local businesses and industry. If you really listen to the teachers, not just the teachers, but your office workers and everything, it's the load and finding some way to reduce the load that is on them every day. And I'm not sure if that may be a technology piece.
Yeah, I was going to say the teacher piece is huge. The pipeline obviously is a big piece, but also the load that they have. I mean, they have more requirements and paperwork and meetings than ever before, it seems like, talking to the teachers when they are trying to make sure they are individualizing and personalizing that education. So how do we continue to see how that is going to work in the future? Also, that it hasn't been named, I agree with the cell phone piece. We've got to look at that and continue to discuss that. But I will take the other area is area of pre-K education, and how is that going to continue to set the stage for our K to job world that we are in public education. But where does that pre-K program go from here? Because when the K1 and 2 students are coming in, the behaviors that they are showing, and it is taking a lot of effort and energy from our teachers and our support staff. And so we need to look at ways that we can continue to partner in the world of pre-K to set the stage right for our students moving forward.
I'm surprised no one mentioned artificial intelligence, because I know it's a big part of the debate,
Well,
but it's a challenge across the board.
No, I think AI is going to be a big deal over the next few years. How are we going to use AI effectively within the schools? That's going to be a challenge.
The last question, then we'll finish out on this. You mentioned being a king for a day, and so I'm going to give you the magic wand. Now, here's the rules with the magic wand. It has to be something you could actually maybe accomplish with a reform or whatnot. Jeff, you mentioned the earlier learning, ramping people up to K through 12, and I'll kind of lead. If I had a magic wand, what might I do for public education? I would look at reforms that ask the question, what does it mean to be complete by 16? And then moving towards your vocational entrepreneurial track, or to remediation before 18, because kids walk out the door when they turn 18. It hurts your graduation rates. Or in that dual enrollment piece, is it functionally happening in regards to that? Earlier, we talked a little bit about discretionary pay. There's a bigger term that falls under, we've discussed for ages, called merit pay, right? What does it mean to institute merit pay models, or at least give school boards the discretion to implement merit pay to keep the teachers they need in key areas and progressively pursue them so they don't leave to other systems? But what would you do with that magic wand? What are some possible reforms you would look at?
I think as much seamless integration of the K-12 and higher ed as possible. I think kind of what you're talking about in terms of things being done at 16 and then moving on to a next step. There are some different countries that do it that way. Certainly, there's some models to look at where that happens. But in terms of what we have now and what we could expand on, the partnerships with community colleges, the partnerships with four-year institutions and those colleges of applied technology to make that ubiquitous. So that's what everyone does.
Ditto. Longitudinal data systems exist for P through 20. We don't use those systems the way that we ought to be using those systems. And so how can we better integrate? We silo between pre-K, K through 12, higher ed, post-work. What we need to do is integrate across the system. 80% of a child's brain is developed within the first 3 years of their life. That's when we got to reach them. But then we've got to help develop them all the way through. If we want Tennessee to grow the way that Tennessee is growing, we've got to meet that education workforce. And to do that, we've got to start early and integrate it all the way together.
I think the pipeline for teachers is exceptionally important, but one of the things that our teachers are talking about now is daycare and the expenses with daycare. So if I had to wave a magic wand, Tennessee as a state would take on methods and ways to reduce the cost of daycare to our families and to our teachers.
Yeah, and the other piece I would say is back to the infrastructure piece. I think we're going to have to really continue to look at that, because I think a key of this is going to be bringing our class sizes down some and adding more teachers if we can, so that we can have smaller class sizes. But our buildings, in order to do that, we're going to have to look at infrastructure and additional buildings and supports so that our teachers can have smaller class sizes. And I think that would be one of those areas that I would wave the wand, is for smaller class sizes for our teachers.
Excellent. So that kind of wraps up the questions with our panel. I want to thank again Cleveland State Community College. I want to thank Mix 104 for carrying this, the legislative delegation, Kevin Raper, Dan Howell for assisting me in hosting this evening, our Board of Education, our directors of schools. Some basic final thoughts. In the state of Tennessee, education still is a priority. It has been the hot topic of discussion. As you have heard tonight with the panel, there's been pretty aggressive investments in education in the state of Tennessee over the past several years, and arguably at a faster pace than any time in history. But we're also responding to social conditions. We're responding to inflated prices when it comes to homes and places to live. You heard Dr. Cash mention the affordability of homes for our teachers. We're responding to a post-pandemic learning environment. It's no longer particularly about the learning loss that happened during COVID, but the cultural shifts that we've seen during that window of time. We're responding to aggressive reforms and changes in technology related to artificial intelligence. And on top of that, in some ways, an increased risk of our students with mental health issues that they're bringing to the classroom. You heard tonight from the panelists the need for behavioral interventions, what teachers have to do, the stress that's placed upon them. And with our students being in the midst of a mental health epidemic, what are we going to do about those things? Who are the people who are addressing those in those settings? You heard that Tennessee has a requirement for publicly funded education. We are required to do that. Every student in the state of Tennessee has that right to a public education, regardless of the baggage that they bring with them to that classroom. How are we going to respond going forward? What I will say is, when we began this discussion tonight with what is public education and who are the stakeholders, public education will always include public schools. Any discussion around school choice, any discussion around public educational funding, the public schools will be a cornerstone of that. Our families demand it, and our leaders demand it, because we take both pride and conviction in the roles of our public schools in our community. And I personally have been on the forefront of rejecting any notion that says we can't have comprehensive discussions around public education and not always be considerate of the quality of public schools in Tennessee. And I hope you'll join me in that endeavor. But let's conclude tonight with just a big round of applause to our panelists.